A lot of the digital health industry is wellness. It's like tracking your function. And there's a lot of users, right? And that's the commercial side of it. That's why these watches exist. It's really convincing people to buy watches to track their well-being, right? But the elegant science of trying to actually figure out how to use this data in a way that's going to improve patient outcomes, I think is very difficult, and more of it needs to be done.
Think about the smartwatches or fitness trackers that many of us use. These gadgets are revolutionizing how we engage with our health and how researchers collect data. From detecting burnout to optimizing clinical assessments, wearables are paving the way for innovative healthcare solutions. That's ahead on this episode of Tomorrow's Cure, a podcast from Mayo Clinic that brings the future of medicine to the present. I'm Kathy Wurzer. Thanks so much for being with us. Today, we're speaking with two experts who are harnessing wearable technology to broaden medical research, which could result in greater personalized preventative medicine. With us, Dr. Arthraa. He's an electrical and computer engineer and senior associate consultant at Mayo Clinic. He also leads Mayo Clinic's Health Engineering and Analytics Laboratory. His lab is building computer engineering systems and using artificial intelligence to improve health and precision medicine. Also joining us is Dr. Jeannie Bailey. Dr. Bailey is an associate professor of orthopedic surgery at the University of California, San Francisco. She's also the director of physical function and biomechanics research core. She's developing, testing, and deploying digital health technology to track and predict a patient's biomechanical recovery following surgery. Dr. Arthraa and Dr. Bailey, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kathy.
I am betting you both probably have wearables somewhere on your body. Am I right, Dr. Arthraa?
I got two of them.
Okay. Dr. Bailey?
Well, I, on the other hand, actually have none. And I have a very old and archaic iPhone. It's very ironic. But yes, I personally don't wear a lot of wearables, but I study them and I use them a lot on patients.
We're going to talk about that. Dr. Arthraa, do you remember when you first heard about wearables? What did you think?
I was a skeptic, and at the time I didn't have the money to buy one. So, but then when I got my first activity tracker back in 2018, it was fascinating just to see how much it collects. And I think ever since then, it's just gotten better and better with time in terms of capacity, capabilities, and the battery, retention. So it's exciting.
Dr. Bailey, when did you become intrigued with the technology?
So I've been studying orthopedic conditions and chronic pain since I was an undergraduate. And when I began research, it was in the lab looking at cadaver spines, very disconnected from the patient. But when I started advancing in my work and thinking about how pain is in living people and it fluctuates, that's when I really started getting into digital health and digital applications, because a lot of our patients require self-management of their symptoms. And so this kind of way to communicate with them or collect daily data from them, it's a very powerful tool. So I started using it or studying it around 2017, I think. My research started looking into phone apps and wearables.
How's the technology changed since 2017, 2018?
Well, when I was a postdoctoral scholar, I was actually using the Microsoft Kinect, if anyone's familiar, to look at patient motion, markerless motion. And it was like revolutionary. And I took it into the clinic to see how patients would move. And like everyone was like so intrigued by it because it didn't require a full motion analysis lab where patients had to like take their clothes off and put markers on their bodies. You could literally just set up this depth sensing camera and then see the skeletal tracking. However, now I flip open the video on our mobile app and we can do skeletal tracking just with basic video because of all the technological advances and what we can derive from video alone. So that's pretty amazing.
What does that look like specifically when you open that app?
When patients open the app and then they take a step back and their body's in the frame, there's like colorful markers that are tracking their joints when they're moving around. But then I get all the data of the markers, the skeleton that's kind of overlaying them, and we can reconstruct 3D motion analysis using that where those markers are moving according to the video. So I'm not actually looking at the video of the patients. I'm looking at the skeletal tracking that's overlaying the video.
Dr. Arthraa, how are you using wearables in your research?
We are using wearables in two contexts. One is to facilitate what we call as real-time interventions. So if we detect a certain behavioral change that can be corrected by providing guided therapy training or through mindfulness activities, then we're using real-time heart rate variability and energy expenditure measurements that we get from these watches to communicate back with our patients. We're also using long-term measurements spanning several weeks and months that can prognosticate, future changes in one's functioning. And so we have these applications that span young children, adults, and so we're using this in quite a variety of ways to meet the needs of our patients, but also being mindful of the fact that the applications are quite different depending on the population we work with. We have successfully used instant heart rate variations, which is in a span of 10 minutes. Where is your heart rate at? And is it indicative of a child being calm, a child being playful versus a child that's internalizing a very irritable situation or something that's making them angry and may flare out? That gives us the amount of time to interface or connect with their parent and remind them of positive parenting practices that might regulate the child's behavior and emotions.
Are you saying that you're able to detect a temper tantrum?
Yeah, actually, that's absolutely where we are at, and so it's giving us that real time control that parents often don't have the ability to see. They're often reactive to an event or an episode, but are not predicting it and being proactive, right? So you don't want the child to be in timeouts all the time. We are also looking into sleep and trying to ask the question of, is there an imbalance in that sleep composition that's predictive of how one feels tomorrow morning, right? So we all wake up sometimes and be like, I really didn't sleep, well, I'm going to have a crappy day, right? So what does it really mean, right? How do you connect the data to that qualitative feel? And I think it's one of those things where year by year there's just more data that we get from these devices and these sensors. We are not trying to really say how will a device X help you with this particular healthcare challenge. It's what are the fundamental measurements that we can get from these devices that's agnostic of the vendor. That any new patient walking through our door with a certain device with them, we should be able to use that data that we get from their streams and facilitate that in measurement or prognostication or prediction or diagnosis as we can go.
I'm wondering about accuracy, reliability. Can it change based upon where the device is on one's body? Dr. Bailey?
Yeah, we did a study with collaborators at Stanford over the last couple of years looking at hip-worn devices versus wrist. And we do see like that hip-worn devices did correlate with actual step count better than wrist-worn for obvious reasons. It's connected to your leg. But then there's pros and cons because, like Arjun said, we want to take advantage of things people are already utilizing and they come into the clinic. Most people are not wearing a hip-worn sensor. They're wearing a wrist-worn sensor. So I think understanding how much variability there is between position, just so we're aware of the, accuracy at the wrist. But really, we're not trying to change the patient's lives to accommodate our data collection. We're just trying to understand how accurate is the data that's coming from the wrist.
And Dr. Arthraa, are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, we've seen measurements that vary quite a bit in even when people are going through different stress phases, like going through pregnancy, for example. It's not comfortable to wear the watch for some, and then for those that are comfortable with it, would like to put on their ankles or on their shoulder up here, or it could be based on their work conditions. We have studies where nurses have worn watches on their arm up here, mainly because of sterility purposes. You want to keep the arms away from anything. And to some extent, we have seen concordance in the measurements, but there's obviously some variations depending on where they wear these devices. I think it's a fair question to ask, how much does it really impact our measurements? But that's the kind of science that, we're doing through our studies.
Another point is that most people have a smartphone at this stage. And actually, our phones collect activity data, but it is probably like the least accurate because it's our phone. We have it in our bag, we have it in our pocket, we have it in our hand. But then if you think about it, there's a lot of that data, though, because people have been carrying their phones around for a decade at this stage. Like, we can go back in time with a lot of that data. So I think sometimes the quantity of the data can actually override a smaller amount of more precise data in our prediction algorithm. So although it's like less accurate and there's all these like issues, we can potentially still learn more from it because there's just so much more of that data for a person's life for the activity.
Dr. Bailey, since you're dealing with folks who have musculoskeletal issues, lower back pain, that kind of thing, can you predict how patients will recover from, say, back surgeries, whether their mobility will improve or not, based upon what you're seeing with some of this data?
What I do is like my lab studies data science of the wearable data. So we're not beholden to any specific motion tracking device. So for instance, we have an Apple Watch study where we take Apple Watch data and patients with chronic low back pain have episodic back pain. And actually, patients that have flare episodes, they end up then seeking healthcare. There's uncertainty. They're worried about how severe it's going to be. So we think with looking at all this tracking data, we can actually anticipate, are you going to have a flare episode and how severe is it going to be? And hopefully that will help ameliorate the fears. So hopefully using the activity tracking, there's a little bit more self-management. There's a little bit more information that can help them guide their decision-making for their healthcare utilization. So what we're doing is looking at a patient's preoperative or pre-treatment overall function, overall activity, biomechanical stability, going back to the markerless motion capture. And we can actually predict recovery phenotypes. Will they be a fast responder? Will they be a slow responder? Will they be a non-responder? And so what we see is that a patient's biomechanical function doesn't directly correlate to their perceived pain. Like, pain can be really variable. And so that's kind of how we're looking at it right now. And the activity tracking stuff is also part of this. Like, we're not just looking at their biomechanical function, we're also looking at how active are these people over time from their watch data? What is their overall health? And that can really inform us of them as a person and what their recovery trajectory will likely be.
You and I talked a while back about a survey that you did, a study that you did about tracking nurses and their potentiality of burnout on the job as they're wearing wearables. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So a few years ago, we embarked on this study that would look at the interplay between mental health, workplace exposures, and burnout. And this was actually just before the onset of the pandemic that we said we should be studying it. And then the grant actually got funded just after the pandemic. And so we were right at the time where we could see how physiological measurements from these watches in terms of heart rate variability, sleep, activity, how intensive are those activities, help not just in predicting burnout, but is it also capturing the ways in which people are resilient to what happens in the workplace? Because this is a highly motivated, extremely vital, and critical workforce in our country. And so we started this study that would look at data from our nurse participants for over a year. And it was interesting because often digital studies don't last that long. We follow patients for a few weeks, months, and then the study is done. But here we're looking at an entire 12 months that can span many things beyond the workplace too, because you go through personal stressors as well. So the study has just concluded, both in Mayo's Rochester and the Florida campuses. We had over 530 nurses in the study complete the program. And it's been a phenomenal experience for us learning from the data. And I believe we've accumulated well over 250 million minutes of data from these devices. And we've had over 80% adherence in two of the four cohorts and over 70% in the other two, which is still remarkable. And the survey rates have been very compelling as well. So, and we've learned a lot along the way in terms of how participants are activating behavior changes, because we kept informing our participants every 3 months of, hey, in these past 3 months, here was your daily sleep, your quarterly average of the number of miles you walk per day, your monthly averages. But we also provided them information about their own functioning in terms of their average heart rate, low heart rate, high heart rate, their measurements leading to how many steps they got in a day, how many stairs they climbed. And some of the participants use that as a way to inform behavior activation, which is, hey, now that I know what I'm doing, what if I walk more or hike more, and then will it help me be more resilient? And so that has been fascinating, because the more people saw the data and then they started working on their own functioning, we actually saw that the overall adherence of wearing the device itself went up. And we did the same study with the physicians too, and the outcomes were pretty comparable in both populations.
Was one thing that you looked at like social network analysis of the nurses with the sensors? And I believe you told me that you saw how ones that had better community among each other tracked by the sensors were more resilient to burnout.
Yeah, there's still more work that we're trying to unpack in there. So one of the many things that people can do is connect with each other, right? So we're all working together on the same unit. Hey, I'm working 10,000 steps a day, and somebody else says, well, I'm doing 15,000 steps a day. And then it becomes a bit of a community participation where they're collectively trying to be better in terms of their overall functioning, and that belongingness kind of increases because of the fact that they're all collectively in the study and learning from each other's functioning and being supportive of each other, which I think is very important.
Is there a way, do you think this could be used then for other groups of individuals who are also under incredible stress? I'm thinking, first responders, others who face crushing stress every day, to kind of extrapolate some of this out toward those groups.
Yeah, I mean, that's really our hope. We do want to work with the broader population as well, first responders, our armed forces, military workforce, because they have a certain time to return to work after a deployment, and the readiness for action is something that we care about. I think we're absolutely interested in that. We're also interested in looking at people coming back from life-changing events like Janie studies spinal surgeries. We're looking at pregnancy, right? Moms have to come back to work within 12 weeks. So what's the kind of capacity building that we need to educate them on in order for them to come back into the workforce or into the workplace feeling fit and healthy? And what's that social support system going to look like if we can build one? Right.
I said earlier that I don't wear any fitness activity trackers, but after I had both my kids, I definitely tracked my data because there's just so much change that happens. It's not like monitoring the day to day. It's like you go from baseline, no sleep, to like trying to become like quasi normal again. And so, yeah, the activity tracking for that is like incredible. And then, I mean, I must say, I did wonder at times if it was maybe not good for me to see the activity tracking and how bad my sleep was.
I'm wondering too, you deal with patients here, Dr. Bailey, that are in a lot of pain, and
Yeah.
as you go into the future, as we go into the future with wearables, can folks then work with and monitor their own pain levels?
I think something really interesting here is that, I work at a big medical center. Mayo is a big medical center. And patients that come here, they're seeking specialty care. They have severe pain. They have severe orthopedic problems. And For the most part, they're going to their doctors for answers. And the doctors see them at times, right? Maybe 3 months before surgery. Maybe they get some imaging. Then they see follow-up, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 3 months. Maybe, I mean, with now telehealth, maybe they see them like a year out, virtually. But we don't see what's happening day to day for these patients living and managing their symptoms that are constant, that are driving them to have spine surgery, that are driving them to have a treatment. And so this technology, I think, really allows patients to be more involved with managing their symptoms, which is at the cornerstone of managing chronic pain. And I think it is a empowering tool. Patient engagement is really like foundational to everything Arjun and I are talking about today. This tracking really enables patients to take ownership and think about their own progress, and it gives them that feedback. They see how they're doing better. They're getting hopeful, and it's definitely affecting them.
Yeah, I could not agree more. When one thinks about remote patient monitoring, it's about creating that access when they need it. And I also see this as a slightly more interesting paradigm where imagine the kind of work that Jenny has done with spinal surgeries, and she creates this toolkit that we could send it to communities that don't have access to routine care and measurements, right? And we see that too. Sitting in Rochester, we get a lot of patients from rural and underserved communities, and it creates that access and not having to wait for 6 months with pain and come back and only be seeing physicians so often. So in some sense, it can hasten referrals. It creates more evidence-based algorithms that we can develop for precise monitoring. And I genuinely think that it allows us to scale the science to people beyond the immediate neighborhoods of San Francisco and Rochester that are part of our programs. And I feel that it'll enhance the participation of our communities in these kind of research programs as well.
I think just continuing with that for a second, I think that's completely correct in that these tools enable us to take this from our clinic, our big medical schools, and make it into a public health kind of thing where now we can get data from people that have these conditions, that have these problems, but aren't just getting care in our clinic. We can study it as it goes across the nation because, like, in the instance of low back pain, it's the number one cause of disability in the world. Right now, we have a large study funded from the HEAL initiative with the NIH looking at phenotyping chronic low back pain cohorts. We've created a large cohort of hundreds of patients across the UC system. But then we have a digital cohort of 3,000 back pain patients across the United States, not even coming to our campus. They're enrolling through our project, through a website. And so we get to actually see how outcomes are changing over time for people not even in San Francisco, not coming to a specialist. How comparable is what we're finding, imaged deep phenotype on-site patients compared to people in different geographical regions of the United States? I think that's really important.
I hear what you're saying, but I wonder if folks don't have access to the technology, maybe they have issues with digital literacy, and these devices are not, inexpensive. Is there an issue with worsening health disparities?
I don't think they're going to worsen health disparities than they already are. I think if anything, we just need to find a way to make it more accessible to narrow the gap that currently exists. This has more potential of narrowing the gap of health disparities than really hard to get and expensive clinic care.
What do you think, Dr. Arthraa?
I've had a huge range of experience in seeing how people welcome these technologies. I can just talk about two extreme cases. One was we had a 4-year-old patient who walked in and took a smartwatch and then tagged it on in 2 seconds. I didn't have to do anything. With the parent, we had to work with them for 40 minutes in educating them on how do you turn it on, how do you latch it, how do you charge it, so on and so forth. And it sounded very arduous for the first 5 minutes. And this particular parent had never seen a smart device ever. That was the first time they ever saw a monitoring device that was as cute and little as it was. But also came in with one of those old school flip phones that had a bare minimum data package. But then we did understand that this may create a disparity, and then we gave them a research enabled device, and then they started to see the benefits of, hey, I'm seeing all of this data which I'd never seen before. Now I'm educating myself more. And so we started creating manuals, which are like very simple. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3, do this. And A means this, B means that, C means this. And it created that last mile education that didn't exist before, but it was in the context of what they needed to learn and talk to other people about, hey, I'm wearing this cool device. This is what I'm learning about myself. That was one end of it. On the other end, what we found was that working with physicians or with nurses and the slightly more technology aware population, right? It was not about telling them, hey, a smartwatch is good for you, but what do you do with it? And the amount of information and the kind of information that we had to feed to them was very different from me trying to educate somebody on how to even turn on a device. So I feel like there's a large spectrum, and if we don't address the literacy aspect of it, of course, there is a chance that it will exacerbate the existing disparities because you can be left out, right? There are technology or care deserts that do exist, and if we don't get technology into their hands, or if we get it to them and they don't know how to work with it, then it's a problem. So I feel like the literacy goes both ways.
Yes.
You got to educate the providers. You also have to educate the patients and community leaders too. The first time we ran our pediatric behavior study, we sent our first patient to school with the watch, and then I got an angry phone call from the school saying, hey, we got to talk to the lawyer. And I said, why? Oh, you didn't get permission. What if this device is recording other children's voices and this and that? And so the community leaders make a big difference. We have to work with them and ensure that this is working in their best interest and not taking things away. And so there's the literacy is just such an important piece that can improve community engagement. It can improve device adherence. It can improve data quality to some extent, but also create that value proposition of what's in it for me if I participated or I wore these devices.
Say, I do have to address this issue because I know you probably have both thought about this an awful lot. That would be privacy concerns with wearables. And people may be wondering, okay, I've got all this information. Where is it going? And how safe is this? Dr. Arthraa, what do you tell those individuals who are participating in your research studies?
Maybe I'll answer this in two parts. One is the context. Right. So we're working with young children and their families. In that particular context, the schools had a valid question on to what extent is this exposing the school's information and other children's information. I had to go back and explain to them that this device is not having a voice transponder. It doesn't record voices. You can't answer phone calls, because a lot of the times the teachers were worried that this device will help you take a phone call from your mother, grandmother, or anybody else, right? So we had to tell them that this is not disturbing the existing ecosystem of your classroom or your play. So to that extent, it was not just protecting the individual, but also people around them, which is very important. And then we obviously have to work with our risk management teams here at Mayo that actually have a very an exhaustive way of looking at to what extent the exposures of these data are to the outside world and things, and they come back and educate us on how to educate our participants on the amount of exposure that they have to these external device manufacturers and so on and so forth. When it came to our nursing and physicians, the biggest question was, are you informing our employers about what we do? Right? Or will my supervisor know about how much am I not sleeping or sleeping? Or do you know where I will be on a Friday night? And so we did a lot of town hall meetings to expose them to the kind of data we get on our site. So I used to show them screen share my labs framework and be like, look, your name is not on our system. It's anonymized. We are able to see the data in the way that it comes. We are not collecting your geolocations. We are not collecting your calendar information. We don't have access to your call logs and things like that, infuses confidence about the information that we are collecting. But beyond that, are there risks of privacy and security and things like that? I think it is there. And to that extent, I personally work very closely with our IT and risk partners to kind of educate us on what's the best way to conduct these studies and what's a sandbox environment to work in. And they do a great job in helping take care of the needs of this very critical issue.
And Dr. Bailey, how about you when you think about these issues?
So for my research, there's kind of two parts to this question. There's all the health kit or the activity tracking data through the smartwatches. And we mainly so far have only been using Apple, which distills all their tracking data through a platform called Health Kit. And then we're just tapping into that. And it's very summary data throughout the day. It's, distilled down. We're not really seeing what's happening on anyone's phone beyond all these metrics that are in the Health Kit. And, we have IRB approval. Like Arjun said, we really can't connect it to anyone's social whereabouts, throughout the week. And we're just seeing how their heart rate is changing. We can't, coordinate with anything else. One thing, with those research studies, sometimes I do send out daily pain questionnaires so we can see how their pain intensity is changing alongside all their health kit data fluctuations. But that's the extent that I think we're connecting the patient personal experience to their health kit data. But then the other side is all my motion tracking work with the video markerless motion tracking. So that's video data, it's remote, it's from their homes. And it took us a year to get our app, big IRB approved for the app. We had to go through, make sure we did all the correct things for data storage. We're not going to use the videos. We're just using it to, derive the skeletal tracking for the biomechanical analyses. And that's also pretty secure because it goes to the app, collects the video, and we just make sure that using proper IRB approaches that we are handling the data in a secure manner.
And IRB is?
Institutional Review Board. It's the every institution, at least here in the States, has a group of folks who are the guardrails for protecting the patient's interests and ensuring that there is safety and that the procedures of the study are aligned with the scientific goals and the premises, and that they really protect the human subjects in accordance with all the guidelines of both the federal and the global standards of patient safety and all the procedures that go with it.
Where do you two see the digital health field going based upon what you've been studying here the past few years? What questions do you think need to be answered, challenges overcome in order to truly move this forward and make impacts? Dr. Bailey?
One thing that Arjun and I talk about a lot is that, a lot of the digital health industry is wellness. It's tracking your function. And there's a lot of users, right? And that's the commercial side of it. That's why these watches exist. It's really convincing people to buy watches to track their well-being, right? But the elegant science of trying to actually figure out how to use this data in a way that's going to improve patient outcomes, I think is very difficult, and more of it needs to be done.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I genuinely feel that we will see more of these integrations happen, not just with watches and apps, but we will also see more voice-based integrations happening in the future.
Really? Can I ask a little bit more about that? That is interesting. So are you telling us that there's the possibility of using one's voice to determine maybe some potential health problems and track that, for instance?
Okay.
So speaking of data, so you said you have got 2 watches, Dr. Arthraa. Yep. And?
Why?
Why? Actually, we had three. I was even wearing an Aura ring, and then I think it's charging in the lab somewhere. Why? Because uh, as Jenny said, we are not beholden to any one of these ecosystems, and it's not like any one of these vendors give us free things to work on. So we want to build technologies that are pan device, and so it's important to know how these different technologies work and differ, so that when we run larger studies, the choice of device doesn't become an impediment to being in research. So,
That's a good point.
like, I can't turn away people who are Android fans just because we are not giving them an Apple Watch, or we are giving them an Apple Watch, or we can't turn away Apple, fans just because we're working with an Android friendlier device. Or we can't turn away both of them because we're not giving them a ring. So in order to really be as inclusive of the different technologies that exist, we are often trialing multiple devices just to sort of understand what these things do. I think it helps us understand the market better as well.
I appreciate your time, and thank you both for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Tomorrow's Cure is a co-production of Mayo Clinic and PRX. Our producers are Deborah Balthazar and David Newtown. The show's edited by Genevieve Sponsler. Our sound engineer is Tommy Bazarian. Our theme was composed and produced by Terrence Bernardo. Tony Carlson is our production manager, and our executive producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez. The Mayo Clinic production team includes Pui Hong Ang, Margaret Shepard, Samantha Clarkson, Kara Mangold, Felipe Sosa, Kim Ona, and Bryn Sankey. Special thanks to Preston Spire for audiovisual production support. Be sure to follow Tomorrow's Cure wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Kathy Wurzer. Thank you so much for listening.